right. Good afternoon to everyone. Fantastic to see you here fighting through the afternoon sessions. I know there's always a lot of competing activities, whether outside the center and certainly a lot of content in. Today, I'd like to talk to you a bit about IoT and where it can create a competitive advantage. I'm going to talk to you for about 4 or 5 minutes, give some perspective and context, and then we'll get to the important part where we have some experts to come up and join us to talk about their specific experiences. This works better when it works. Oh, it's working on one only. Here, let's go back. Thank you. All right, so let's talk about some definitions, because obviously there's a lot of definitions out there around artificial intelligence. You can pick one, but let's go to the key themes of this: scientific activity, right? The science of training systems to emulate human tasks through learning and automation. The key thing with science is there has to be a path to execution, a path to the return on that value. So you ask the question, why now? What's different around AI, considering the fact that it's not a new concept, right? The term was coined in the mid-50s, I believe. The idea of neural networks have been around for all of those years, but the change has really come with the advancements in compute and networks, as you saw the transition into the 90s, the focus on machine learning, so transitioning to models that actually learn and continue to learn from the data itself. And then the transition into deep learning, the idea of speech recognition, the idea of object detection, expanded use of computer vision. And advancements have continued down those paths. And what we're starting to see now is a significant transition to what we refer to as applied artificial intelligence. Again, getting to the importance of that transition from proof of concept to something that is generating a return on your investment. So the opposite question, if you ask why now, why not? And I don't think the space presents a lot of different hurdles than we've had historically across industry. There's always a lack of budget, always unclear ROI or anyone that'll sign up for it, lack of buy-in at all levels, executive all the way down to individual contributor. And specifically in the IoT market, as well as AI, there's difficulty in identifying and securing talent over the long haul, data science, citizen data science, even other applied areas. So certainly understand the hurdles that are there. But recently, we're seeing additional hurdles that are out there. It's not just the old pushback, right? The idea of we don't have an IoT data strategy. Think about the complexities that are out there, moving from cloud to on-premise, and now the return to the edge is complexities that many companies haven't dealt with, so that's an additional hurdle. The idea of the infrastructure, where do we move all of this data through? The advancements in network, from mesh to satellite, certainly a lot of discussion around 5G of late. And I talked a bit about the idea of differentiating between POC and operationalized analytics. We see a tremendous amount of really good AIoT projects that die on the vine from the fact that many are conducted within a lab without some understanding or intent built in to actually deploy it into operations, which is where you're really getting your sustained value. So a lot of the why not is out there and always can be an excuse. So we thought quite a lot about it, and we pulled in some external perspectives as well. I thought this was a good one from Forbes. IoT will give rise to artificial intelligence. So we're starting to see a dependence attached between IoT and AI. Or what about the other side of the equation? IoT won't work without artificial intelligence. So you're starting to see these wholly dependent on one another, and it's an easy conclusion to make, because if you look at the scale of data with respect to IoT, you very quickly get outside the capabilities, or at least human capabilities, to generate insight from that data. So we've been quite interested in understanding, as we look across multiple industries, who are making advances and why. So we've partnered with a number of our partners in the space, IDC, Intel, and Deloitte, to generate a survey and to try to get some indication of wider scale adoption and more broadly, an understanding of what companies are doing that are generating results and moving through the execution phase. And you can see some of the responses, the high-level responses that we're getting from the survey, and many are or have been quite surprising to us. Let's look at the top one. 90% of those heavily using AI with IoT are exceeding value expectations, right? Not completely aligned to some of the write-ups that we found previously. 3 out of 4 respondents, the combined value of AI and IoT capabilities exceeded initial expectations. So this is an indicator that you're starting to see that transition from those POCs that oftentimes weren't generating the value of some of the early projects, and we're starting to see a certainly return on that investment. Senior leaders already believe the combination of AI and IoT is strategically important. So we talked about the hurdles earlier, starting to see that buy-in and the recognition of returns. And you can read through the others. By the way, this survey was actually released today, and you can get access to it at the SAS booth. But what I wanted to spend the bulk of the time today doing is bringing up some experts with those perspectives in hand. So I'd like to invite Garrett and Andy to the stage. So certainly you two can give a better introduction to yourselves than I can, so if you could go through that, it'd be great.
Sure. Thanks for, am I on? Thanks for having me. I'm the GM for Wabtec's Transport. Am I on? No? There we go. Hi, everyone. Garrett Fitzgerald. I'm the GM for Wabtec's Transport Intelligence business. We focus our technology solutions on the railroad industry globally. And I like to think of my business as our IoT business, and that we have a hardware and software platform product line that helps to bring monitoring and data solutions out into the rail industry.
And I'm Andy Decker. I lead Deloitte's IoT practice in the U.S. and have been very active in this space in the last 5 or 6 years.
All right, so fantastic. Thank you both for joining. So Andy, you just heard the opening, the idea of 90% of those that are heavily using are seeing significant return, 3 out of 4 when combined. I know that was surprising to me, but I wanted to get your perspective.
It was surprising to me, too. We clearly tapped it. Our customers are very sophisticated, apparently, because I still do see a lot of companies struggling with achieving the value. But what does make sense to me is the correlation between AI and higher returns and more value. Because I think, once you get past the basics of connecting, various devices and gathering data, you really, to drive operational changes, you need to sort of layer on top the insights that come out of that data. And examples are, very common. I work a lot in the industrial IoT, so smart factories, smart manufacturing. And a lot of companies will go out and connect a bunch of their machines on a line, and the initial set of use cases is just, hey, I'm seeing a lot of alerts and alarms that data was trapped before. I couldn't even visualize it in any way. So that's great. I now know when I'm having problems, but I don't know what to do with it. And once I've gathered a sufficient amount of data, I can start to get ahead of that, understand the patterns in the data, and recognize problems before they occur. And that's really where the machine learning comes in, takes hold, and drives more value.
Fantastic. So kind of pivoting a bit, Garrett, so you saw the pushback, right, that so often you see in those that are common to traditional projects. I can't get budget or I can't get support. But you have those new areas, this new infrastructure, this distributed network that's there. What are your experiences with defining these hurdles?
I mean, I think as I look especially at the railroad industry, the first hurdle is actually a little bit about what you were just talking about, which is some of the core and very basic infrastructure and steps that have to be taken before you can start to implement more complex AI models, right? And for us, we have assets that have been out in the field for 30 years or more in some cases. And so there's a big investment just to get to the point where you understand the data that those assets are generating, and you find ways to capture it and standardize it and make it available in the first place. But once you clear that hurdle, and once you start to then get a better understanding of your operations, and you mix the context of your business with the data that you're now collecting, That's really when you can start to employ AI in the field to drive either operational or reliability improvements. And that's where we really focus on, is helping our customers along that entire journey.
All right. So Andy, similar experience. How's it playing in manufacturing and energy?
Yeah, it's very similar. And I think many clients are still, one of the big challenges we see is having the right people that they can use to apply the data science required for getting that sort of next level of insights, and especially in the manufacturing world. Plants tend to be in fairly remote locations where there's not an access to the kind of talent that's necessarily required, and so that's one of the other hurdles that we see. And so we see, I think we'll talk about this in a little bit, but companies starting to centralize some of that activity, and of course by connecting all of it and putting it into a platform where you can visualize data centrally, you have the ability to create models and create an analytics or a digital or an AI organization that is more of a central organization that can kind of drive and deploy those models out to the field.
Fantastic. So staying with you, Andy, again, I tried to pull out those things that really stuck out to me. For those of us that grew up around operations, AI is a perfect fit. And in my mind, that's where the substantial benefit is going to reside. But as we look at the survey response, I was surprised to see so much of these AI projects targeted at what I would view as, it's not real-time process, operational planning, forecasting, those out years, that this is a value to. Can you talk to what you're seeing in that space?
Yeah, the survey was, I think the way I read the results was that AI provided more value to planning than to sort of just IoT standalone, right? So when you looked at IoT standalone, there wasn't a lot of value planning. When you added AI to it, there was a lot more value to the planning process. And I think that makes, it did make a lot of sense to me. I think when I think about, maybe to take the example that I was talking about earlier, where companies are working on connecting machines in a manufacturing facility, trying to drive better uptime, more OEE, so throughput through the plant and so forth. What they're to really get to higher levels of value, they start to think about okay, now that I understand my basics of what's driving downtime and unplanned downtime, I can start to change the way I plan my maintenance schedule, and I can plan, but really reduce my planned downtime windows and try to optimize the kind of my maintenance crew and the shift work and so forth around that. So that drives a whole quantum leap in terms of the value achievable to a company. And so it makes sense to me that sort of planning and forecasting and the ability to really stay ahead of the game is really where AI plays a much bigger role.
Right. So do you see that significant in certain areas? Are there different levels of maturity by industry?
Oh, yeah, definitely. And that's again, sort of in the in industrial product space, we see the automotive companies generally tend to be a little bit of the leaders there. They're more volume based, and so they tend to be the bigger companies. They tend to have a few more resources to apply. So versus some other sort of lower volume, in industrial products, and even frankly, some of the aerospace and defense companies are a little bit behind in that regard because they've been it's a little slower to embrace some of the newer techniques.
Right. So extending to Garrett. So I thought the survey, and maybe this was just a different perspective than what I had. It was an either or. So it's traditional analytics or it's AI, and they either do it for real-time activity or it's futures and planning. But I always viewed that as more of a maturing process. But I was surprised to see how they put things in buckets. Or at least that's the perspective. Garrett, are you seeing that are they segmented activities or?
I mean, I think as you're alluding to, I don't think it's an either or an or. In fact, we find that even as we develop and get to a place of greater maturity where we're using AI models in the field, whether that's for real-time alerting and real-time planning, or whether that's for kind of the long-term planning that you were just talking about. Either way, even once you reach that milestone and you get to that level of maturity, it doesn't mean that some of the more traditional analytic models or even just basic descriptive analytics don't still play a pivotal role in achieving some eventual outcome for the customer. And especially as you're starting the implementation of AI solutions where the machines in your systems are starting to make decisions for themselves and guide that decision making. I think also just from a societal standpoint and a cultural standpoint, having the ability still to get descriptive information and using those basic descriptive analytics that are better understood to describe what's happening, even if it is after the fact, gets operators more comfortable with starting to transition that decision making to the systems and to the assets themselves. I think it's also important to note that, and I think you said it in the early part of your presentation, which is AI is not new even for an industry as old as the railroad industry. We've had solutions that leverage AI to do decision making in terms of how the railroads plan out their network movements and operations, and as well as our trip optimizer product, which is essentially an autopilot for locomotive, uses AI to plan a trip and run more fuel efficient over the course of that trip. And what we see is, though, as we can bring together more comprehensive visibility across the customer ecosystem, which comes with some of those more basic descriptive analytics, and start to integrate these systems and integrate these AI models, you start to get to another step function of benefit where now those two examples I just gave, if your train doesn't have to be at its destination for 3 hours, you can tell the trip optimizer system that those two models can work together to now run even more fuel efficiency and take real cost out. So, I think that they all build on one another. There is no either or. And even once you reach that level of maturity, you still end up doing some of the more basic modeling at the same time.
Yeah, I was just going to just pile on maybe a little bit here, but I feel the exact same way. There's definitely a continuum of capabilities I think while AI has been around for a long time, what's new is just the volumes of data that are available now that everything's connected. It goes into a platform, through the cloud, through the internet, what have you. And so going from, connected to sort of descriptive, more reactive, to more proactive, prescriptive, predictive, and then at some point more fully autonomous, where you're trusting those decisions enough to sort of loop and feed back to take the operational decision and take the human out of the loop in some cases. We are not there yet in the manufacturing world for the most part. That is, we're sort of advancing up that curve, but not nearly at the place where I think most of my clients anyway are trusting enough of the data and I think that's years away to automate certain processes fully.
Certainly a case where technology may be in place before there's a full comfort level with letting these things run autonomously. I thought as I looked through the survey response, one of the things that really caught my eye is you're looking back. So go back 5, 6, 7 years, and within the space, some of the leaders in what was the IoT market were the network providers, right? And that provided some insight in itself that essentially these projects were about gaining access to data and perhaps getting it into the cloud. And I think again, some of the early perceptions is that these things, this is overhead, right? This is a cost. And so there's been that transition to where most of the discussion now is transitioning more to outcomes. So you work with a tremendous amount of clients. Is that a consistent theme that you're seeing as well?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and you're right. The telematics, has been around, and the telcos were very heavily involved. And I remember early in my career at Deloitte, we were doing work with OnStar, which at the time was General Motors' first, sort of remote telematics service that they offered based on, cellular connectivity into the vehicle. So now I forgot your question.
So are you seeing the transition from those early projects that were really about data aggregation to now an outcome-based initiative?
Yeah, and I think, and this again, I go back to the first question you asked about, the percentage of clients seeing value. I think that shift has definitely occurred where, there was a lot, 5 years ago when I really got started in this in earnest for Deloitte, there was a lot of, gee whiz, gosh, if I can get this data, isn't it cool that I can see, things, in real time, and that phase has passed, right? And those are I think you referenced it in your opening around, there's a lot of initial pilots or proof of concept. It's sort of dead end there because there's not a business intent. There's not a thought around, well, what is the value of the data and what business outcome am I trying to drive? I think most of my clients are starting to get a lot more sophisticated. Well, they'll do a proof of value now. So they'll have a set of KPIs that they want to move the needle on. They understand basically what data they're going to need to drive those outcomes, and they'll set up a pilot in order to prove out that value case.
Right. So kind of along a similar point, Garrett, the idea of these self-funding initiatives. So let's identify what data we have in place. Let's identify some value we can generate and use that as a jumping off point for future use cases. Are you seeing that in your market?
Right. Well, I mean, I think not that every industry doesn't have some level of this, but the rail industry is very driven, business case, ROI, payback period driven in just about every dollar that they spend. It's a very capitally intensive business as well, so they're very focused on cash. And, I think that as we deploy solutions to our customers, we can't just go in and say, listen, if you deploy all of this hardware and you build up all of this connectivity, and if you invest $100 million in your IoT solutions, we can deliver you nirvana. That pitch doesn't go very far. But what does is, as we talk to them about, understanding their current state, and everyone has varying levels of capability. I'm not going to say one is further along than others. I'm just going to say different a lot of times. And once you understand that and the business, the problems that they're incurring today and the challenges they want to solve today, then you can incrementally build to say, hey, let's do this project and deliver this value, right? And then the next project and the next value. And that really helps to drive the evolution. I think there's a question as to whether or not that's going to be fast enough, over time as the rail industry competes more and more with trucking, and as we see autonomous vehicles and autonomous trucking really start to make a lot of significant progress. But at the same time, it is a very healthy way to drive investment in this space to make sure that year over year you're paying back quickly the investment you're putting in.
Fantastic. So kind of changing topics a bit, one of the hurdles that I mentioned, Andrew, earlier was the inability to get executive support for most projects. But this survey presents something, at least on the surface, that is totally different. And again, the thing I like about the insight provided by the report is that, or the survey, is that it provides some reflection on the changing market. So again, I go to 4, 5, 6 years ago, the executive interest was really around what I would refer to FOMO, fear of missing out. I want to be a part of this IoT thing. But now the survey suggests that it's something different that's driving the executive support.
I would still argue, though, that executives don't buy IoT or approve IoT or AI in and of themselves, right? They're a means to an end. They're part of a Industry 4.0 initiative, or they're driving new revenue streams in smart connected products of some sort or another. Digital manufacturing. So there's lots of different kind of initiatives that we get involved in, but that AI and IoT are sort of the foundation of. But I still don't think that most executives still are a little skeptical around investing heavily in just something that is more technology based rather than business based.
All right. So again, pivoting topics just a bit. One of the elements that seemed to rise to the top in the survey is that these early movers were seeing significant returns. However, as someone who is engaged with the industry daily, you see many cases where good enough is presented. I can get close enough there within the industry. So they're not really pushing the envelope with respect to some of these projects. So kind of a closing project or question, and I ask this to both of you. How long is good enough going to be substantially relevant in these markets?
I mean, I think specific to rail, good enough ends at the point when autonomous trucking can get to a platooning capability. So a lot of people think of autonomous trucking as, the nirvana is where all trucks are driving themselves, but there's a reality that the cost point between rail and trucking gets closed, and then trucking surpasses it at the point when you can have one driver and then maybe 3 or 4 trucks autonomously platooning behind them, which really isn't that far away, really, from a regulatory or a technology perspective. And, so I think at that point where you see now trucking get to a cost profile that is similar to, or in some cases better than, rail for that long haul freight, especially in terms of just intermodal and packaged goods, that's going to be a point where the railroad industry needs to be able to respond and start to compete with trucking on timeliness and just speed overall, to be able to survive and stay competitive. So, I think a lot of our customers are very cognizant of that fact, and that's one thing that's driving them to invest in technology. But it's also changing how they run their operations, and so we have to think about how we change technology to suit that as well.
All right.
Yeah.
Andy?
Yeah, I think there's similar dynamics in most of the industries that I'm serving, and I mentioned, largely, kind of discrete manufacturing industries, industrial products, automotive, aerospace and defense. I think my clients are asking, 2 fundamental questions. Are we trying to compete on the basis of operational excellence, and we want to be, sort of the most efficient, the most automated manufacturing environment? And that's so we have companies that in the past, aerospace and defense companies that produce, products in the, tens of products per day versus automotive companies producing thousands of products per day. They're starting to converge. So we have aerospace and defense clients that say, I want to be more automotive. I believe that if I'm going to compete as a manufacturer, I have to be able to have as an efficient and automated a process as an automotive company. The other basis of competition is, well, I'm going to compete based on innovation, and every industrial products company sees the days coming of autonomy, of their fundamental changes in the way vehicles are propelled, so moving more to electric vehicles versus, sort of gasoline-powered vehicles and things like that. Those are foundational shifts, and I think companies are going to choose one of those 2 paths, and frankly, either of them, this technology is going to be central to being successul.
Right. I think in our earlier conversation, we talked about some industries have disruptors that enter an Uber, or as several examples in the space. But some have these that are, it's a slow gain, and then one day you recognize that, maybe I didn't react fast enough. And you were talking about that in rail. Interesting that there's that one pivot point that will one day, you end up on the outside looking in.
Yep. Yeah.
So fantastic. So with that, I think we're about ready to wrap up. It looks like we have a couple of minutes for any questions for the panel. And I can't see anything out there, so. All right. All right, with that, then we'll wrap it up. Garrett, Andrew, thank you very much for your time today, and thanks everyone for attending.
All right. Thank you.